This is Bigger Questions with your host, Robert Martin.
Welcome to Bigger Questions. Today's big question, why do we create fantasy worlds? We're asking today's big question to Luke Isham. Luke works as the pastor of St Kilda and Balaclava Presbyterian Church in Melbourne's inner southeast. Luke is a huge fan of the writings of JRR Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and the classic Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he joins me now. Luke, welcome to Bigger Questions.
Thanks, Rob.
But you are a massive Tolkien fan, apparently, and that didn't even influence the way that you conducted your wedding?
Yeah. So my wife Amy and I, we got married in 2003 in early December, and then Amy wore her wedding dress as she was dressed up as an elvish princess to the 2003 Boxing Day premiere of The Return of the King, because I dressed up previously for the first two movies.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's great that you can join us today to talk about something that seems to be close to your heart, Luke, that you seem to enjoy a lot about. And to kick off Bigger Questions, we like to ask some smaller questions just to get us thinking. Today, we're asking Luke Isham why we create fantasy worlds. So, Luke, for our smaller questions today, I'm going to see how much you know about the Lord of the Rings movie series. Now, obviously, it seems like you watched them. You watched them with your wife dressed up as an elvish princess. Just one question, and it's multiple choice. Okay, which of the three Lord of the Rings movies was the highest grossing at the box office? Was it A, Part 1, The Fellowship of the Ring, Part 2, The Two Towers, Part 3, The Return of the King, or D, they were pretty much all the same. They grossed about the same amount each. Which of the films was the highest grossing at the box office?
Oh, that's a tricky one. Everyone was really excited about the first one. It won't be The Two Towers, because that was the one in the middle.
Yep.
I think I'm going to have to go D, because I
They're
can't choose.
all about the same.
Yeah, because I can't choose between the first one and the last one. So
Well, you're close, because they were all roughly the same. They all grossed around $1 billion each. But actually, C, Part 3, Return of the King, grossed US 1.14 billion, where the other two films didn't quite get over the billion mark. So unfortunately, Luke, you thought you knew about the Lord of the Rings movie.
yeah.
Your knowledge there is a little bit of a fantasy,
right.
perhaps. And if we had a live audience, we'd still give you a round of applause.
Yeah.
But Luke, it has been 20 years or so since the release of the first Lord of the Rings movies, The Fellowship of the Ring, on 19th of December 2001. Now, the series has been regarded as one of the greatest and most influential film series ever made. The three films grossed nearly $3 billion US, and the books, Lord of the Rings books, have sold over 100 million copies. What do you think makes the Lord of the Rings so popular?
They're a magnificent movie experience.
Yeah.
So Peter Jackson, in an interview around the time of the release of the Lord of the Rings, says he's wanting to be faithful to the source material.
Yeah.
So that attitude of the director kind of helps if he's wanting to be faithful to the source material. Although he's obviously very gifted with special effects, and so the timing in sort of cinematic history was right. He had the ability to bring it to life. And then, of course, the setting in New Zealand. So the special effects, the setting, and Peter Jackson's kind of, hey, we're going to work with the source material was the sort of makes it a magnificent. And also long form. It was a long form series. So we'd had blockbusters before that, but it was entering the age of long form television and big movie franchises. So it was new. That was new then. And then I guess we've had sort of two generations. So when it came out in 2001, we had sort of two generations primed for watching it. So you had the baby boomers, because Lord of the Rings was originally published in the 1950s and then didn't really sort of take off. It was sort of a very niche, but really took off in the 60s, early 60s.
Right.
And so all the baby boomer sort of countercultural sort of reading it and, enjoying reading about the Ents and sort of an anti-technological sort of progress message. And then all the Gen X read it as teenagers or played Dungeons and Dragons. So you had sort of baby boomers and Gen X primed, two generations of an audience just ready to watch it. Yeah, so they're probably the first two. And then the last reason's a little bit more, I don't know what you think of this one, but I think it expressed the background zeitgeist of the times of 2001.
What in particular about that Times did it express?
Well, so you just 9/11 had just happened. So the
Yeah.
90s was the American era, and then the 9/11 marked those attacks marked the end of that era. And then God's Illusion was published in 2006. So the next decade was sort of a secular decade. So you had this kind of the rise of secularism, the end of American sort of cultural dominance, and so it was a sort of the movies tapped into something happening at a deeper cultural level.
Okay. What particularly did it tap into?
It tapped into this medieval worldview. So C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were both sort of medieval specialists in different ways. And so they were sort of immersed in the medieval worldview. And The Lord of the Rings is this, well, the whole fantasy genre is sort of a medieval genre.
Yeah.
But we live in a post-medieval time. So I think that's what makes it sort of doubly fascinating is people were looking back at an old worldview, and we live in a post-medieval worldview. So that's what makes the genre of fantasy and Lord of the Rings so interesting.
Okay, yeah. So then what did you make of the film adaptations of the books then?
So they were released in Australia on Boxing Day, and so we all dressed up and we were photographed on the front page of the local newspaper in Hobart, and we booked out a cinema. Um, got 50 of our friends to buy tickets, and all with the first ones in to
Yeah.
and sort of watch the first showing with everyone else in Australia on Boxing Day, and it was really exciting. That first Fellowship of the Ring, because the trailers had kind of primed us to go, this is faithful to the source material, and yeah, it was exciting to see the world that because I'd grown up hearing my parents read it aloud, The Lord of the Rings and the Narnian Chronicles to us as kids. So I'd had it all in my mind, and it was just wonderful to sort of see it brought to life. But yeah, Peter Jackson,
He's the director.
so by the end of it, I wasn't as excited because it had started to become more of Peter Jackson's project and interpretation rather than a retelling of Lord of the
A
Rings.
faithful retelling of the story, yeah.
That's right.
Well, for example, there were some characters that were completely not in the movies that were in the books. Like, for example, Tom Bombadil, who features in the Fellowship of the Ring. He's missing entirely. No, sorry for the spoiler alert, but the films have been out for a while. What do you make of those kind of changes?
It feels as though the number of shortcuts kind of built up, and because The Lord of the Rings is presenting a worldview, a way of thinking, a genre, um, you've got to kind of be presenting that genres, presenting that feeling cinematically, and
Mm.
it felt like yeah, Peter Jackson made some compromises, and you mentioned Tom Bombadil, and that's one of them that he cut out Tom Bombadil.
So what's lost then by losing Tom Bombadil? What do you think's lost?
Well, I think it loses because Tom Bombadil's he's a character that's sort of immune to the effects of the ring. So the ring has this. Well, we're doing spoilers. So it has this power, this evil power, and everybody who comes into contact with it is affected by it in some way, negatively, or has to work hard at resisting it. And Tom Bombadil is immune to it because he's this sort of creature from another world in Middle Earth. And that little vignette, that little moment is sort of the medieval worldview because it's a creature from another world in our world.
Mm.
And yeah, that would have been a normal way of thinking for the medieval people, is to think this.
Right. But you're saying that that's not necessarily the way that Peter Jackson thinks or reflective of our culture. And so hence some of those sort of more supernatural kind of characters, so to speak, don't seem to make it into the world of the
Yeah,
modern Lord of the Rings, so to speak.
here's a better example. Actually, here's a better example. So you have Frodo and Samwise Gamgee. They're the
Hmm.
so they're the two main sort of hobbits that have to take the ring to Mount Doom. And there's a bit that Jackson took out in The Return of the King about Samwise Gamgee, and he takes the ring for 24 hours. And there's this really fascinating chapter at the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring where he has the ring and he puts it on and starts using it a little bit, and he's tempted, and it's this really powerful moment of an
Mm.
ordinary person dealing with massive evil, and the events all around that are really exciting. Is that spider Shelob, and it's in Mordor, and it's really intense. But Jackson cuts that out. Now, he obviously, it was just too much to put in the film,
Yes.
but that's a really good example of Tolkien's worldview and the medieval worldview. It shows that even though Jackson was a great director and worked hard, and it's a cinematic masterpiece, there's something in Tolkien's worldview that he compromised on.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And that you said that that's to do with this medieval world. Can you
Mm.
unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, yeah. So the medieval worldview. So a really good sort of introduction to that is The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis
Hmm.
was another professor that lived and wrote at the same time as Tolkien, and the two key things of the medieval worldview is a storyline. So we're part of a story. But to go back one step, in the ancient world, a story happened to you. So if you read
Hmm.
Herodotus and those type of guys, it's about the story just happens and happens to you. Whereas the Judo-Christian view is that we're participants in the story. And so
Right.
obviously the medieval world was a Judo-Christian world, and we're participants in that story. And so that's part of the medieval worldview. And the other part of the medieval worldview is a sort of everything has a symbolic structure. For example, everything has kind of layers of meaning, and you see this in the Lord of the Rings. This, not just that we're participants in the story, but that everything is sort of multi-layered. It has
Mm.
depth in all directions.
Mm. Tolkien did have Christian convictions and was committed to the Bible. So, how much did that influence what he wrote?
Oh yeah, massively. Because I think the Lord of the Rings is well, let's go back a step. So the gospel is a theodicy. So how and
Hmm.
why do evil coexist in the world?
Yes.
And the Lord of the Rings is a theodicy.
Yeah. Unpack that. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? How is the Lord of the Rings a theodicy or an explanation of evil in the world?
Yeah, so you want to have an explanation that scales. So how do you, as an individual, deal with evil, good and evil? How does it coexist in your own life, and then in your neighbours' lives, and then in the world around you? So whatever explanation you have, say for the world around you, that needs to also make sense for your neighbours and yourself, and the other way as well. If you've got an explanation for yourself of good and evil, then it needs to make sense for your neighbours and the world.
Right.
And so that you could say that's depth, and the Lord of the Rings has depth, and it's a theodicy with depth. So you have a cosmic struggle, the forces of Mordor versus Gandalf, and the sort of the ragtag alliance that he's putting together. You've got that cosmic struggle, but then you've also got Frodo and Sam struggling, with escaping enemies and finding food and making their way to Mount Doom, and Sam
Yeah.
struggles with it, and then Frodo's struggles and failure. So you've got that. That's why it's a theodicy that works at different levels, because you've got it happening in the story at
There's a
different
cosmic
levels.
level, and then there's an individual level as
Yeah,
well that
that's
you're
right.
battling there.
Yeah,
So, but with Tolkien's work though, it's not a straight allegory
that's
though, because
right.
some people would say it's an allegory or sort of there are certain things that represent things in the real world. Whilst it
Yeah.
kind of does that, it says not straight because, for example, there are different characters which seem to represent the Christ character.
Mm.
So, for example, there's elements of Frodo's quest which resonate with Jesus' life, death, and crucifixion, and then there's Gandalf's resurrection, and Aragorn is the one crowned king. So, is that deliberate?
Yeah, I think he's sort of the archetypes. So you've got sort of,
Hmm.
Gandalf is a sort of Christ archetype. He fights the Balrog, dies, or has a type of death experience, and then has a type of resurrection experience.
Mm.
You could say Frodo and Sam sacrifice themselves, um, but none of them, map clearly onto Christ. So Frodo fails at the end. Gandalf isn't the one that destroys the ring. So there's sort of, he's dealing with archetypes that and tropes that are Christian.
Mm.
He does drop some really sort of nerdy or geeky Christian clues into the story, because everything's very precise and you can create a timeline. So, for
Right. Yeah.
example, the Fellowship, that's that little group that Gandalf pulls together to travel to Mordor to destroy the ring. they start their journey from Rivendell on Christmas Day, the 25th
Right.
of December, and then the ring is destroyed the next year on the 25th of March, which is Annunciation, when the angels tell Mary that she's carrying the Messiah. And so these kind of, that's a deliberate move of
Right.
Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien is a Roman Catholic, sort of loved the liturgical year, but that's the structure's kind of built in as a clue to the reader. Let the reader understand.
Yes. You mentioned before that that fantasy genre, and particularly Lord of the Rings, represents a medieval worldview, and also that Tolkien wrote his book to represent a biblical worldview. Are you suggesting, therefore, that the Christian worldview is more associated with the medieval worldview, or is it that means it's out of place, perhaps, in the modern world?
Yeah. Yes. No. I like that question. Absolutely, because both Tolkien and Lewis fought in World War One,
Yeah.
and I think, yeah, Tolkien was at the worst battle, the Battle of the Somme. I think that was the worst battle in World War One, and I think he got sick right after that battle, and then was sent back. And then Lewis was injured in a different battle by a shell fragment, and so they both had front row seats on World War One, which was sort of the end of the sort of progressive Enlightenment. So everything was getting better and better. The Industrial Revolution was going to save us all, and things were just going to get more and more wonderful. Technology was going to make our lives better and better. And then World War One came through and showed us that the horrible things, followed by World War Two, the horrible things that technology, in the wrong hands can do. And
Mm.
so, yeah, they're both writing at this sort of crucial time in history, the end of an era, the beginning of another era. And going back to your original question, that's what makes the Lord of the Rings movies, because they come out at a sort of an interesting time of change, in the change of
Mm.
culture. So Tolkien and Lewis are seeing a change in the culture, and
Mm.
the Industrial Revolution was the sort of the end of the medieval worldview. And now, I think what makes the Lord of the Rings still so relevant and important for Christians is it's this vehicle to understand and think about the medieval worldview. And the medieval times weren't perfect, and there's elements of that worldview that you can dig into that weren't quite right, but it's still a helpful way of thinking. It's a holistic way of thinking.
What about the medieval view that makes it helpful?
Yeah, I think it's that symbolic structure to the world. Well, the two things: the story, that we're
Hmm.
participants in a story, but then the other aspect is that everything has a sort of a spiritual and a moral dimension to it. And I don't know how many of your listeners are fans of Jordan Peterson, or not, but I think the reason of his popularity is he's kind of put his finger on, there's a bit of a meaning crisis at the moment, and we're sort of
Mm.
searching for meaning. And I think the power of The Lord of the Rings for Christians is we can go, well, here's a fictional vehicle of a Christian worldview, and that's partly why the movies were so successful. It's a wonderful vehicle for expressing why Christianity makes sense, why the gospel as a theodicy, as an
Mm.
explanation for good and evil, at all levels makes sense.
Well, on the question website Quora, someone asked the question: is the Bible technically a fantasy book with some historical events thrown in? So, how do you react to that? Is the Bible just another fantasy novel? The world that Tolkien was drawing on? Is
Yeah.
it fantasy on fantasy?
Well, let's go back a step and define what fantasy is. So, what is fantasy? So, I think fantasy is a genre. I was thinking fantasy is a combination of Dante and Beowulf sort of mashed together. That's the fantasy genre. Sort of the
Right.
monsters of Beowulf and the morality of Dante. That's the fantasy genre. And so and it's deliberately fictional. So in that sense, the Bible is not deliberately fictional,
Mm.
but the Bible is deliberately symbolic, and so it's like Dante, and it's kind of communicating a particular symbolic worldview. And then, like Beowulf, it has monsters and a struggle between good and evil, and it's an exciting story. So in that sense, the Bible is in that same territory. Or you could say the Lord of the Rings is an alternative, sort of fictionalized version of our world.
Mm.
So, yeah, it's a fantastical explanation of our world. It's an alternative
Mm.
creation of our world.
But I suppose as you've just said, some people say because the Bible does contain, fantastic beasts and things at different times or supernatural events, that it is just actually not actually really historical or connected to reality at all. It is just a story. I mean, what are your reactions to that?
I think the crucial thing that the Bible makes is because it's this theodicy, it's talking about good and evil and monsters and symbolism, that, it's just this highly symbolic book, that the temptation can be, oh, well, it's just purely a
Mhm.
created secondary world. But I think
A work of fiction. Yeah.
yeah, the provocative, it's just like Dante. You're just reading Dante, or you're just reading Beowulf. You can enjoy and get all the symbolism and from that, and all the moral lessons. You could get moral lessons from Beowulf and Dante. But the sort of the provocative step in Christianity, the step that the Bible takes, is it says, well, this is a story of symbolism and monsters, but it's also a story that took place. And it's also the same step that you take as a Christian. You say, well, this worldview makes sense,
Mm.
and it also happened. That's the Christian theodicy. It's not just a useful explanation for good and evil, but it's one that took place in our timeline.
Mm. Well, in the Bible, in the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, after God has created a man, we hear the narrator describing one of the tasks of this man in Genesis 2:19-20, where it says, "Now the Lord God had formed out of the ground all of the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals." So, Luke, what's the significance of this, of the man naming animals in this early book of the Bible?
Yeah, it's a really good verse because it's the man, it's Adam as sub-creator.
Hmm.
This idea is the idea that Tolkien used to push Lewis into becoming a Christian, because he wrote this poem called Mythopoeia, um,
Yeah.
to sort of convince Lewis of this idea that God is the creator, we're sub-creators. And there's actually a line in this poem that says, man sub-created the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. And Tolkien's putting poetically that verse from Genesis chapter 2. Adam is
Mm.
naming, he's identifying, he's participating in the story of creation. And we do that as humans. We create stories, we participate in stories. We're sub-creators.
What does it then tell us about our humanity then?
I think we're not just rational creatures, we're not just biological creatures, we're sub-creators, where we mimic our creator by creating things, stories, works of
Mm.
art, families.
And this is connected with The Lord of the Rings, I suppose, as the ultimate fantasy book, movie, or piece of work.
It's Tolkien being a sub-creator and encouraging the audience to be their own sub-creators as they imagine this world.
But also, it's Peter Jackson as well, is representing his humanity as well, because he's created, again, showing he's demonstrated that he's a sub-creator as well, even though he may disagree with Tolkien's trajectory at points. He's also demonstrated this thing that the Bible's pointing out here about our humanity, that we are sub-creators.
Absolutely, he can't help himself. He, as a sub-creator, he's a creative guy. You look at the special effects company he created, and it's this impulse to be a sub-creator,
Mm.
and then he's given this material, and combined with his impulse at the time of history, yeah, sort of a
Mm.
perfect combination.
So, look, you obviously enjoy fantasy novels and the work of Tolkien. What persuaded you that the Bible and that believing in Jesus wasn't just a fantasy story or another myth?
I think it was going back to the theodicy and the historical reality question. I was convinced by the worldview of Christianity. I could see it working in my own life. I could see this worldview scaling up and making
Mm.
sense of the whole world. But if it was only that, then it would be ultimately hollow. And so the beautiful thing about being a Christian, and the thing that convinced me, was to see that the storyline that I was participating in was a real story. And I was part of that. And then at another part of the world, a couple of thousand years ago, the crucial event, that, the defeat of evil, you could go to that place and you could look around and you could see the empty tomb and you could see the Roman ruins, and you could, this is a real event. This gigantic cosmic story is a true story, and I'm part of it.
Mm. So after you've read Lord of the Rings, you've been watched the Lord of the Rings movies, but perhaps a little bit disappointed at times. Has that enhanced or detracted from your Christian faith?
Yeah, I'd say the Lord of the Rings has deepened, and made me more excited. It's helped me to understand my Christian faith. It's helped me to, and it also helps me to communicate.
How has it helped deepen your faith?
I think it's helped me feel the symbols of my faith. It's helped me, rather than just experiencing them as propositions, I get to participate in my faith by immersing myself in these symbols and thinking about them and talking about them.
So, Luke, why do we create fantasy worlds?
I think we create fantasy worlds because we are subcreators. We mimic our creator and we create worlds, and we also create fantasy worlds because it's a way of thinking about the Odyssey and thinking about good and evil and the medieval way of thinking. So the medieval fantasy world is an excellent vehicle for that.
Well, let me leave you with some of the Bible's answer to this big question: why do we create fantasy worlds? From Genesis 2:20. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. I look forward to you joining us next time for bigger questions. Thanks very much to our guest today, Luke Isham.
Thanks, Rob.